Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. Purity of heart is to will one thing. Chapter 3. Barriers to willing one thing. Variety and great moments are not one thing. So let us then, upon the occasion of a time of confession, speak about this sentence. Purity of heart is to will one thing, as we base our meditation on the Apostle James's words in his epistle, chapter 4, verse 8. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded, for only the pure in heart can see God, and therefore draw nigh to him. And only by God's drawing nigh to them can they maintain this purity. And he who is in truth wills only one thing, can will only the good. And he who only wills one thing when he wills the good can only will the good in truth. Let us speak of this, but let us first put out of our minds the occasion of the office of confession in order to come to an agreement on an understanding of this verse, and on what the apostolic word of admonition, purify your hearts, ye double-minded, is condemning, namely, double-mindedness. Then at the close of the talk, we may return more specifically to a treatment of the occasion. If it is to be possible that a man can will only one thing, then he must will the good. To will only one thing, but will this not inevitably become a long drawn-out talk? If one should consider this matter properly, must he not first consider, one by one, each goal in life that a man could conceivably set up for himself, mentioning separately all of the many things that a man might will? And not only this, since each of these considerations readily becomes too abstract in character, is he not obliged, as the next step, to attempt to will, one after the other, each of these goals in order to find out what is the single thing he is to will, if it is a matter of willing only one thing? Yes, if someone should begin in this fashion, then he would never come to an end. Or, more accurately, how could he ever arrive at the end, since at the outset he took the wrong way and then continued to go on further and further along this false way? It is only by a painful route that this way leads to the good, namely when the wanderer turns around and goes back. For as the good is only a single thing, so all ways lead to the good, even the false ones, when the repentant one follows the same way back. O thou the unfathomable trustworthiness of the good! Wherever a man may be in the world, whichever road he travels, when he wills one thing, he is on the road that leads him to thee. Here such a far-flung enumeration would only work harm. Instead of wasting many moments on naming the vast multitude of goals or squandering life's costly years in personal experiments upon them, can the talk do as life ought to do, with a commendable brevity stick to the point? In a certain sense, nothing can be spoken of so briefly as the good, when it is well described. For the good without condition and without qualification, without preface and without compromise, is absolutely the only thing that a man may and should will, and is only one thing. O blessed brevity, O blessed simplicity, that seizes swiftly with cleverness, tired out in the service of vanity, may grasp but slowly. That which a simple soul and the happy impulse of a pious heart feels no need of understanding in an elaborate way, since he simply seizes the good immediately, is grasped by the clever one only at the cost of much time and much grief. The way this one thing is willed is not such that one man wills one thing, but that which he wills is not the good. Another wills one thing, nor is what he wills the good. A third wills one thing, and what he wills is the good. No, it is not done in that way. The person who wills one thing that is not the good, he does not truly will one thing. It is a delusion, an illusion, a deception, a self-deception that he wills only one thing. For in his innermost being he is bound to be double-minded. Therefore the apostle says, purify your hearts, ye double-minded. That is, purify your hearts of double-mindedness. In other words, let your heart in truth will only one thing, for therein is the heart's purity. And again, it is of this simple purity of heart that the apostle is speaking when he says, if someone lacks wisdom, then let him pray, but in faith, not like a double-minded man. James 1, 5, 6, and 8. For purity of heart is the very wisdom that is acquired through prayer. A man of prayer does not pore over learned books, for he is the wise man whose eyes are opened when he kneels down. In a word, then, there is a man whose mind remains piously ignorant of the multitude of things, for the good is one thing. The more difficult part of the talk is directed to the man whose mind, in its double-mindedness, has made the doubtful acquaintance of the multitude of things and of knowledge. If it is certain that a man in truth wills one thing, then he wills the good, for this alone can be willed in this manner. But both of these assertions speak of identical things, or they speak of different things. The one assertion plainly designates the name of the good, declaring it to be that one thing. The other assertion cunningly conceals this name. It appears almost as if it spoke of something else, but just on that account it forces its way searchingly into a man's innermost being, and no matter how much he may protest, or defy, or boast that he wills only one thing, it searches him through and through in order to show the double-mindedness in him if the one thing he wills is not the good. For in truth there was a man on earth who seemed to will only one thing. It was unnecessary for him to insist upon it. Even if he had been silent about it, there were witnesses enough against him who testified how inhumanly he steeled his mind, how nothing touched him, neither tenderness nor innocence nor misery, how his blinded soul had eyes for nothing, and how the senses in him had only eyes for one thing that he willed. And yet it was certainly a delusion, a terrible delusion that he willed one thing. For pleasure and honor and riches and power and all that this world has to offer only appeared to be one thing. It is not, nor does it remain one thing, while everything else is in change, or while he himself is in change. It is not in all circumstances the same. On the contrary, it is subject to continual alteration. Hence, even if this man named but one thing, whether it be pleasure or honor or riches, actually he did not will one thing. Neither can he be said to will one thing when that one thing which he wills is not in itself one, is in itself a multitude of things, a dispersion, the toy of changeableness, and the prey of corruption. In the time of pleasure, see how he longed for one gratification after another. Variety was his watchword. Is variety, then, to will one thing that shall ever remain the same? On the contrary, it is to will one thing that must never be the same. It is to will a multitude of things. And a person who wills in this fashion is not only double-minded, but is at odds with himself. For such a man wills first one thing, and then immediately wills the opposite, because the oneness of pleasure is a snare and a delusion. It is the diversity of pleasures that he wills. So when the man of whom we are speaking had gratified himself up to the point of disgust, he becomes weary and sated. Even if he still desired one thing, what was it that he desired? He desired new pleasures. His enfeebled soul raged so that no ingenuity was sufficient to discover something new. Something new. It was change, he cried out, for as pleasure served him, change, change. And it was change that he cried out for as he came to pleasure's limit, as his servants were worn out. Change, change. Now it is to be understood that there are also changes in life that can prove to a man whether he wills one thing. There's the change of the perishable nature when the sensual man must step aside, when dancing and the tumult of the whirling senses are over, when all becomes soberly quiet. That is the change of death. If for once the perishable nature should seem to forget to close in, if it should seem as if the sensual one had succeeded in slipping by, and death does not forget. The sensual one will not slip past death, who has dominion over what belongs to the earth, and who will change into nothing the one thing which the sensual person desires. And last of all, there's the change of eternity, which changes all. Then only the good remains, and it remains the blessed possession of the man that has willed only one thing. But that rich man, whom no misery could touch, that rich man who even in eternity to his own damnation must continue to will one thing, ask him now whether he really wills one thing. So too with honor and riches and power. For in the time of strength as he aspired to honor, did he really discover some limit? Or was that not simply the striver's restless passion to climb higher and higher? Did he find some rest amidst his sleeplessness in which he sought to capture honor and hold it fast? Did he find some refreshment in the cold fire of his passion? And if he really won honor's highest prize, then is earthly honor in itself one thing? Or in its diversity, when the thousands and thousands braid the wreath, is honor to be likened to the gorgeous carpet of the field, created by a single hand? No. Like worldly contempt, worldly honor is a whirlpool, a play of confused forces, an illusory moment in the flux of opinions. It is a sense deception, as when a swarm of insects at a distance seems to the eye like one body, a sense deception, as when the noise of the many at a distance seems to the ear like a single voice. Even if honor were unanimous, it would still be meaningless, and the more so, the more thousands that create the unanimity. And the greater the multitude that created unanimity, the sooner will it show itself to be meaningless. And indeed, it was this unanimity of the thousands that he desired. It was not the approbation of the good men. They are soon counted. No, it was rather the approbation of the thousands. Is then this desire for counting, is this to will one thing? To count and count until it suffices? To count and count until a mistake is made? Is this to will one thing? Whoever therefore wills this honor or fears this contempt, whether or not he is said to will one thing in his innermost being, is not merely double-minded, but thousand-minded, and at variance with himself. So is his life when he must grovel in order to attain honor, when he must flatter his enemies in order to attain honor, when he must woo the favor of those he despises in order to attain honor, when he must betray the one whom he respects in order to attain honor. For to attain honor means to despise oneself after one has attained the pinnacle of honor, and yet to tremble before any change. Change, yes. Where does change rage more unchecked than here? What desertion is more swift and sudden, like a mistake in foolery, like a hit by a blind man when the seeker for honor has not even time to take off the garb of honor before insult seizes him in it? Change, the final change, the absolute certainty among the range of unpredictables. No matter how loud the thunder of honor may sound over his grave, even if it could be heard over the whole earth, there is one who cannot hear it, the dead man, he who died with honor, the single thing he had desired. But also in dying, he lost the honor, for it remains outside. It marches home again. It dies away like an echo. Change, the true change, when eternity exists. I should like to know if honor's crown is offered to the much honored one there. And yet eternity is more just than the earth and the world. For in eternity, there is a crown of honor laid aside for each of those that have in truth willed only one thing. So also with riches and power and the world that passes away and the lust thereof. The one who has willed either of them, even if he only willed one thing, must to his own agony continue to will it when it has passed, and learn by the agony of contradiction that it is not one thing. But the one who in truth willed one thing and therefore willed the good, even if he be sacrificed for it, why should he not go on willing the same in eternity, the same thing that he was willing to die for? Why should he not will the same when it has triumphed in eternity? To will one thing, therefore, cannot mean to will that which only appears to be one thing. The fact is that the worldly goal is not one thing in its essence because it is unreal. Its so-called unity is actually nothing but emptiness, which is hidden beneath the manyness. In the short-lived moment of delusion, the worldly goal is therefore a multitude of things, and thus not one thing. So far is it from a state of being and remaining one thing, that in the next moment it changes itself into its opposite, carried to its extreme limit, What is pleasure other than disgust? What is earthly honor at its dizzy pinnacle other than contempt for existence? What are riches, the highest superabundance of riches, other than poverty? For no matter how much all the earth's gold hidden in covetousness may amount to, is it not infinitely less than the smallest mite hidden in the contentment of the poor? What is worldly omnipotence other than dependence? What slave in chains is as unfree as a tyrant? No, the worldly goal is not one thing. Diverse as it is in life, it is changed into its opposite, in death into nothing, in eternity into damnation, for the one who has willed this goal. Only the good is one thing in its essence, and the same in each of its expressions. Take love as an illustration. The one who truly loves does not love once and for all, nor does he use a part of his love and then again another part. For to change it into small coins is not to use it rightly. No, he loves with all of his love. It is wholly present in each expression. He continues to give it away as a whole, and yet he keeps it intact as a whole in his heart. Wonderful riches! When the miser has gathered all the world's gold in sordidness, then he has become poor. When the lover gives away his whole love, he keeps it entire, in the purity of the heart. Shall a man in truth will one thing, then this one thing that he wills must be such that it remains unaltered in all changes, so that by willing it he can win immutability. If it changes continually, then he himself becomes changeable, double-minded, and unstable, and this continual change is nothing else than impurity. Now, willing one thing does not mean to commit the grave mistake of a brazen, unholy enthusiasm, namely to will the big, no matter whether it be good or bad. Also, one who wills in this fashion, no matter how desperately he does it, is indeed double-minded. Is not despair simply double-mindedness? For what is despairing other than to have two wills? For whether the weakling despairs over not being able to wrench himself away from the bad, or whether the brazen one despairs over not being able to tear himself completely away from the good, they're both double-minded. They both have two wills. Neither of them honestly wills one thing, however desperately they may seem to will it. Whether it was a woman whom desire brought to desperation, or whether it was a man who despaired in defiance, whether a man despaired because he got his will, or despaired because he did not get his will, each one in despairing has two wills, one that he fruitlessly tries wholly to follow, and one that he fruitlessly tries wholly to avoid. In this fashion has God, better than any king, ensured himself against every rebellion. For it has indeed happened that a king has been dethroned by a rebellion. But each rebel against God, in the last instance, is himself reduced to despair. Despair is the limit. Here and no further. Despair is the limit. Here are met the cowardly, timorous ill temper of self-love and the proud, defiant presumption of the mind. Here they are met in equal impotence. Only too soon personal experience and the experience of others teaches how far most men's lives are from being what a man's life ought to be. All have great moments. They see themselves in the magic mirror of possibility which hope holds before them while the wish flatters them. But they swiftly forget this sight in the daily round of things. Or perhaps they talk enthusiastic words, for the tongue is a little member and boasteth great things. But talk takes the name of enthusiasm in vain by proclaiming loudly from the housetop what it should work out in silence. And in the midst of the trivial details of life, these enthusiastic words are quickly forgotten. It is forgotten that such a thing was said of this man. It is forgotten that it was he himself who said it. Now and then, perhaps, memory wakens with horror, the remorse seems to promise new strength. But alas, this too lasts only for a good-sized moment. All of them have intentions, plans, resolutions for life, yes, for eternity, but the intention soon loses its youthful strength and fades away. The resolution is not firmly grounded and is unable to withstand opposition. It totters before circumstances and is altered by them. Memory, too, has a way of failing, until by common practice and habit they learn to draw sympathy from one another. If someone proclaims the slender comfort that excuses yield, instead of realizing how treacherous is such sympathy, they finally come to regard it as edifying, because it encourages and strengthens indolence. Now, there are men who find it edifying that the demand to will one thing be asserted in all its sublimality, in all its severity, so that it may express its claim into the innermost fastness of the soul. Others find it edifying that a wretched compromise should be made between God, the claim, and the language used. There are men who find it edifying if only someone will challenge them. But there are also the sleepy souls who regard it as not only pleasing, but even edifying to be lulled to sleep. This is indeed a lamentable fact. But there is a wisdom which is not from above, but is earthly and fleshly and devilish. It has discovered this common human weakness and indolence. It wants to be helpful. It perceives that all depends upon the will, and so it proclaims loudly, "Unless it wills one thing, man's life is sure to become one of wretched mediocrity, of pitiful misery. He must will one thing regardless of whether it be good or bad. He must will one thing, for therein lies a man's greatness." Yet, it is not difficult to see through this powerful error. As to the working out of salvation, the Holy Scripture teaches that sin is the corruption of man. Salvation therefore lies only in the purity with which a man wills the good. That very earthly and devilish cleverness distorts this into a temptation to perdition. Weakness is a man's misfortune, strength the soul's salvation. When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry and empty places, but finds no rest. Then he turns back again, and now he brings with him that unclean cleverness, the wisdom of the desert and the empty places, that unclean cleverness that now drives out the spirit of indolence and of mediocrity, so that the last stage becomes worse than the first. How shall one describe the nature of such a man? It is said of a singer that by over-screeching he can crack his voice. In like fashion, such a man's nature, by over-screeching itself in the voice of conscience, has cracked. It is said of a man who stands dizzy upon a high place, that all things run together before his eyes. Such a man has made himself giddy in the infinite, where those things which are forever separate run together into one thing, so that only the vast remains. It is this dryness and emptiness that always gives birth to giddiness. But no matter how desperately such a man may seem to will one thing, he is double-minded. If he, the self-willed one, had his way, then there would be only this one thing. He would be the only one that was not double-minded. He the only one that had cast off every chain. He the only one that was free. But the slave of sin is not yet free, nor has he cast off the chain, because he scoffs at it. He is in bonds and therefore double-minded, and for once he may not have his own way. There is a power that binds him. He cannot tear himself loose from it. Nay, he cannot even wholly will it, for this power too is denied him. If you, my listener, should see such a man, although it is unlikely, for without a doubt weakness and mediocrity are the more common, if you should meet him in what he himself would call a weak moment, but which, alas, you would have to call a better moment, if you should meet him when he had found no rest in the desert, when the giddiness passes away for a moment and he feels an agonizing longing for the good, if you should meet him when, shaken in his innermost being, and not without sadness, he was thinking of that man of single purpose who, even in all his frailty, still wills the good, then you would discover that he had two wills, and you would discover his painful double-mindedness. Desperate as he was, he thought lost is lost, but he could not help turning around once more in his longing for the good. How terribly embittered he had become against this very longing, a longing that reveals that just as a man in all his defiance has not power enough wholly to loose himself from the good, because it is the stronger, so he has not even the power wholly to will it. Perhaps you may even have heard the desperate one say, "Some good went down with me." When a man meets his death by drowning, as he sinks, without being quite dead, he comes to the surface again. At last, a bubble comes out of his mouth. When this has happened, then he sinks, dead. That bubble was the last breath, the last supply of air that could make him lighter than the sea. So with that remark. In that remark, the last hope of salvation expired. In that remark, he gave himself up. Was there still concealed in his thought a hope of salvation? Hidden in the soul, was there still in this thought a possible link with salvation? When a remark is pronounced in confidence to another man, oh, terrible misuse of confidence, even if the desperate one only misused it against himself. When this word is heard, then he sinks forever. Alas, it is horrible to see a man rush toward his own destruction. It is horrible to see him dance on the rim of the abyss without any intimation of it. But this clarity about himself and about his own destruction is even more horrible. It is horrible to see a man seek comfort by hurling himself into the whirlpool of despair. But this coolness is still more horrible. That in the anxiety of death a man should not cry out for help. I am going under, save me. But that he should quietly choose to be a witness to his own destruction. O most extreme vanity, not to wish to draw man's eyes to himself by beauty, by riches, by ability, by power, by honor, but to wish to get his attention by his own destruction, by choosing to say of himself what at most pity in all sadness may venture to say of such a person at this grave, yet some good went down with him. A horrible doubleness of mind in a man's destruction, to wish to draw a sort of advantage out of the fact that the good remains the only thing that a man has not willed. For now the other will becomes apparent to him, even if it were so weak as to be but a feeble dallying in the moment of destruction, an attempt to be exceptional by means of his own destruction. To will one thing cannot, then, mean to will what in its essence is not one thing, but only seems to be so by means of a horrible falsehood. Only through a lie is it one thing. Now just as he that only wills this one thing is a liar, so he that conjures up this one thing is the father of lies. That dryness and emptiness is not in truth one thing, but is in truth nothing at all, and it is destruction for the man that only wills that one. If, on the contrary, a man should, in truth, will only one thing, then this thing must, in the truth of its innermost being, be one thing. It must, by an eternal separation, cut off the heterogeneous from itself in order that it may in truth continue to be one and the same thing, and thereby fashion that man who only wills one thing into conformity with itself. In truth, to will one thing, then, can only mean to will the good, because every other object is not a unity, and the will that only wills that object, therefore, must become double-minded. For as the coveted object is, so becomes the coveter. Or would it be possible that a man by willing the evil could will one thing, provided that it was possible for a man so to harden himself as to will nothing but the evil? Is not this evil, like evil persons, in disagreement with itself, divided against itself? Take one such man, separate him from society, shut him up in solitary confinement. Is he not at odds with himself there, just as a poor union between persons of his sort is an association that is ridden with dissension? But a good man, even if he lived in an out-of-the-way corner of the world and never saw any human being, would be at one with himself and at one with all about him, because he wills one thing and because the good is one thing. Each one who in truth would will one thing must be led to will the good, even though now and then it happens that a man begins by willing one thing that is not in the deepest sense the good, although it may be something quite innocent, and then little by little he is changed, really in truth, to will one thing by willing the good. Love from time to time has, in this way, helped a man along the right path. Faithfully he only willed one thing, his love. For it he would live and die. For it he would sacrifice all, and in it alone he would have his eternal reward. Yet the act of being in love is still not in the deepest sense the good, but it may possibly become for him a helpful educator, who will finally lead him by the possession of his beloved one, or perhaps by her loss, in truth to will one thing, and to will the good. In this fashion a man is educated by many means, and true love is also an education towards the good. Perhaps there was a man whose enthusiasm reached out toward a definite cause. In his enthusiasm he desired only one thing. He would live and die for that cause. He would sacrifice all for that, in which alone he would have his happiness. For love and enthusiasm are not satisfied with a divided heart. Yet his endeavor was perhaps still not in the deepest sense the good. Thus enthusiasm became for him a teacher, whom he outgrew, but to whom he also owed much. For as it is said, all ways lead to the good, when a man in truth only wills one thing. And where there is some truth in the fact that he wills one thing, this is all for the best. But there is danger that the lover and the enthusiast may swerve out of the true course and aim perhaps for the impressive instead of being led to the good. The good is certainly also in truth the impressive, but the impressive is not always the good. And one can bid for a woman's favor by willing something when it is merely impressive. This can flatter the girl's pride, and she can repay it with her adoration. But God in heaven is not as a young girl's folly. He does not reward the impressive with admiration. The reward of the good man is to be allowed to worship in truth. Wow, that chapter from Kierkegaard there was a little bit rough, and I know that there are going to be some that are even rougher, both in terms of conceptually, like as well as in the way that things are worded. It's just it can feel very convoluted, and so it's probably something that you're going to want to have text alongside of, so you can look at it. You're going to want to repeat it, maybe slow it down a little bit, because it's a little bit dense. And like I told you at the beginning, I am not an expert at philosophy or on Kierkegaard or anything, so there's a whole lot there. And that I get new things every time, and I know that there are tons of things that I'm going to miss. So this is meant to be a springboard for you to get into Kierkegaard, make it accessible to you through audio, and then hopefully you enjoy it enough to be able to go out and explore him some more and get some scholars and experts on him. But I want to pull out a few different ideas for you to mull over a little bit as you're thinking through what you just heard from Kierkegaard. It's really in this chapter where the idea of the good being only one thing gets fleshed out a little bit more. So that's something that you're going to want to try to understand a bit, and you're going to want to read through those sections that talk about the one thing. Because that's really the crux of what Kierkegaard is trying to get at. Essentially saying that no matter what you will, right, everything you do comes from the exertion of your will, and it is only when you choose to do the good thing that you get one thing, right? That's one unchangeable thing. And I love the analogies that Kierkegaard gives, but the one thing that Kierkegaard, the one example that I like that he gives is just this idea of honor. Right? He talks about this person who wills honor, and you might say, well, honor is just one thing, right? He just wills honor from other people, like he wants to be esteemed. And I mean, there are reasons that you want to be esteemed, right? Maybe esteemed so you can have power over other people, so you can. There are lots of reasons you would want to be esteemed, and Kierkegaard talks about just this endless cycle. If you traced why did you do this? Well, I did this to get that, to do this, to get that, right? There's this endless cycle of things, and it's only the good thing that is self-contained. And so this idea of honor is something that Kierkegaard goes into a lot, and if you go back to that section, listen to that a couple times through and look that over. It's just a great example of something that is not really one thing that people might think is one thing. And Kierkegaard pits that against love. And I love the example that he gives there as well, where he says, if you have a miser who stores up all of the gold and he gets the last piece of gold in the world, versus somebody who loves, he's like, well, the miser essentially has nothing, whereas the person who loves has everything still. Right? If the miser has no more to get, right? He's attained it all, and if he gives one piece away, he no longer has all that there was to have. So not only can he not receive any more, but he can also not give any more without changing his state. Whereas the person who loves can not only receive love, continue to receive love perpetually, but that person can give all of their love away. Like, they can love with all of their being and all of their soul in every single moment of their lives and give that love away, and they haven't lost any of it. And so this one thing is an eternal thing. It's the good, and the all other things are temporary things, and they're finite things. And there's a part in here where Kierkegaard talks about the variance of pleasure, how it's just leapfrogging from one pleasure to another, and change, right? Always just another pleasure, a new pleasure, one more thing, something different. And that reminds me a lot of Chesterton in his book Orthodoxy. Has this beautiful section where he talks about how he talks about how, like, a human can look at the sunrise and be like, ugh, you know what, that's old, and he's like, you know what, it's not God who's old. It's not that the sun that keeps coming up and down every day. It's not that the world is old. It's that we are old. He said God is like a youth, like your kids. They can say, do it again, daddy, do it again, daddy, a million times over, whether it's playing horsey or whatever they play, right? Do it again, daddy. And he's like, God's a youth. He says, oh, that was so beautiful, the sunrise. Do it again, son. He says that every morning. Do it again, son. Because God has not lost his youthfulness, right? There's an eternal aspect to this beauty of the sunrise. And when we get tired of it, because we're double-minded, because we are not eternally minded, and we lose sight of things like that are eternal, like beauty and love. And that also reminds me of my absolute favorite poem that's called Ozymandias. And it's a beautiful, maybe not beautiful, that might not be the best word to describe it, but it's a fantastic poem that I think gets at this idea of despair and changeableness, and how fickle things like honor are. So here's the poem, Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of this colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I like that poem so much because of all of the, I don't know what the technical literary term is, but like, it seems like irony, right? You can, there's this traveler who comes and he's talking about this like ancient artifact that he found in the middle of the desert. There's nothing else around it, just sands, and this statue is like falling apart. It's and there's nothing around it. But he reads this inscription, and this was supposed to be just a magnificent sculpture created by slaves, created by somebody who feared their master and revered him. And he says, I am the King of Kings. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, right? Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And you just get that irony of like, man, Ozymandias, whoever he was, somebody we don't know, he thought he was pretty cool, But look at him now. Like, nobody knows his name. All of his monuments are gone. The people who served him, who honored him, is gone. Like, all of his honor is gone. And Kierkegaard talks about that, how death, eventually ends that, ends the double-minded sorts of things. And they're not eternal. And it's just it's a very sobering picture of what things like honor, what these double-minded things are really like. Things that we act as if they're eternal. We act as if they have value, but ultimately are, make us look foolish in retrospect. But then that brings us to the last thing I want to pull out of this section, which is Kierkegaard talks a bit about despair here. And it's interesting, he talks about probably my second favorite book from Kierkegaard is Sickness Unto Death. And in that, he talks a lot about the idea of despair. And I think he wrote Sickness Unto Death like 2 years before this, or maybe this was 2 years before that. I don't remember exactly. But here, despair is interesting because it's a tool. And in Sickness Unto Death, it was a tool as well. Like he says, hey, look, despair is a gift because when you come to the point of despair, it brings you to kind of a crossroads where you make a decision. Like, how do you get yourself out of that despair? How do you deal with it? It's cognitive dissonance. It's a good thing if you handle it rightly. Well, here, I love how Kierkegaard talks about how all roads lead to the good. And he said, even if you're really, really far down a double-minded road, a bad road that is leading away from the good, it actually still leads towards the good. But the way that it leads towards the good is through repentance, which is turning around, right? That road that you're going down towards double-mindedness, if you just do a 180, that road is going to take you back to that intersection where if you turn right and then at the next intersection turn left, and like it's going to connect you to the good, but you got to turn around. And Kierkegaard will talk more about repentance in some of the later chapters, but I thought that was just a beautiful way of kind of seeing things. No road is wasted ultimately, because as you're going down this road of double-mindedness, and eventually if you are taken to the point of despair, and of course there can be different levels and realizations of despair, but as you become more and more despairing, you're still on the road to the good through repentance, and that's beautiful. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and we'll come out with the chapter 4 next week.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.